The sun was setting over Arlington, Virginia, casting long shadows across the tree-lined suburban streets. Special Agent Ann Lee drummed her fingers lightly on the steering wheel of her modest Honda Civic, thinking about the mountain of paperwork waiting for her at home. After 15 years with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, she'd learned that real change happened through careful documentation, even if it meant late nights reviewing case files. The gentle hum of her car's engine and the soft melody from the radio were suddenly interrupted by the sharp flash of red and blue lights in her rear-view mirror. She checked her speedometer. 32 in a 35 zone. Puzzled but composed, she guided her car to the curb, following the protocols she taught countless times in FBI training sessions. The approaching footsteps were deliberately slow, heavy boots crunching against the asphalt. Through her side mirror, Anne watched Officer Robert Wilson's deliberate stride, noting how his hand rested unnecessarily on his holster, a subtle intimidation tactic she documented numerous times in her investigations. License and registration. He barked before even reaching her window, his tone carrying none of the professional courtesy typically expected from law enforcement. Anne maintained her calm, reaching slowly for her glove compartment while keeping her other hand visible on the steering wheel. "Good evening, officer," she said pleasantly, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" She handed over her documents with practiced efficiency, making sure to include her FBI credentials alongside her driver's license. Officer Wilson barely glanced at the documentation. "Your taillight's out," he stated flatly, though Anne knew for certain she checked all her car's lights just that morning, a habit formed from years of meticulous attention to detail. The officer's demeanor shifted subtly as he noted her features in the fading light. His lip curled slightly, and his grip on her documents tightened. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice carrying an edge that made it clear this wasn't a routine traffic stop anymore. "Officer Wilson." Anne read his nameplate carefully. "I don't believe that's necessary for a taillight violation." "I'm happy to." "I said, step out of the vehicle." His voice rose sharply, cutting through the quiet suburban evening. A couple walking their dog on the opposite sidewalk slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold with concerned expressions. Anne's mind raced through her options. As an FBI agent, she knew her rights intimately, but she also understood how quickly situations like this could escalate. She interviewed countless victims of similar encounters, taken their statements, seen their tears, and documented their bruises. Now, ironically, she found herself on the other side of the equation. Maintaining her professional composure, she slowly unbuckled her seatbelt. "I'm complying, officer," she announced clearly, knowing her words were being captured by his body camera. "I'm going to exit the vehicle now." Each movement was deliberate, calculated to avoid any misinterpretation. As she stepped out into the cooling evening air, Officer Wilson's aggressive stance became more pronounced. The couple across the street had stopped entirely now, the woman quietly holding up her phone, its camera likely recording. Anne felt a mix of gratitude and sadness, grateful for the witnesses, but saddened by the familiar pattern playing out. "Hands against the vehicle," Wilson commanded, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made Anne's stomach turn. She complied, feeling the cool metal of her car against her palms. Despite her high-ranking position in the FBI, despite her years of service to justice, despite her impeccable record, at this moment, she was just another target of the very behavior she'd spent her career fighting against. Little did Officer Wilson know, this routine traffic stop was about to become a pivotal moment in his career, and not in the way he expected. As he reached for his handcuffs, the sound of another police cruiser approaching in the distance echoed off the suburban homes. The evening was far from over, and this encounter would soon send ripples through the entire law enforcement community. The tension in the air grew thicker as Officer Wilson held Agent Ann Lee's FBI credentials in his hands, turning them over as if searching for signs of forgery. The nearby streetlights flickered on, casting harsh shadows across his increasingly frustrated expression. He'd been on the force for 12 years, and something about this stop wasn't going according to his usual script. "These look fake," he declared, waving her credentials dismissively. "Anyone can get a badge like this online these days." His voice carried a hint of mockery that made the young couple across the street shift uncomfortably. Their dog whined softly, picking up on the growing tension. Anne took a steady breath, keeping her voice level despite the absurdity of the situation. "Officer Wilson, you can verify my credentials by calling the FBI field office. I'd be happy to provide you with a direct line." She maintained eye contact, her years of training helping her stay composed even as her heart raced. "People like you always have some kind of story," Wilson scoffed, deliberately dropping her credentials onto the hood of her car instead of handing them back. "Always think you're above the law, don't you?" The implications in his tone were clear as day. A cool evening breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of children playing in their yards. The normalcy of the suburban setting made the officer's behavior seem even more out of place. More neighbors had begun to notice the scene, with several curious faces appearing in nearby windows. "Officer," Anne spoke clearly, knowing his body camera was still recording, "I want to understand what you mean by people like me. Could you clarify that statement?" Her investigator's instincts kicked in, documenting every word, every micro-expression. Wilson's face reddened slightly. "Don't try to twist this around. I've dealt with plenty of fake IDs and people trying to impersonate federal agents." He took a step closer, attempting to use his height to intimidate her. "And they all act just like you, thinking they're so smart." The woman across the street was still recording with her phone, while her partner had taken up his own device. They weren't even trying to be subtle about it anymore. Another police car rolled slowly past the scene, but didn't stop. The officer inside merely glanced their way and continued driving. Anne noticed Wilson's hand twitching near his belt. Her trained eye caught all the warning signs of an officer losing control of his emotions. She'd seen it countless times in case files. The build-up, the escalation, the moment when authority turned into abuse. "Officer Wilson," she tried one more time, her voice steady but firm. "I understand you're doing your job, but your current conduct is concerning. Would you like to contact your supervisor to verify my credentials?" She knew offering this option would either force him to back down or push him over the edge. His response came in the form of a sharp laugh. "Oh, now you're telling me how to do my job." He reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer." The young woman across the street gasped audibly. Her partner whispered something about not being right and calling someone. The dog began to bark, picking up on its owner's distress. Anne could have resisted. She could have pulled rank, made threats, or demanded immediate intervention. But she knew better. Every moment of this interaction was building a case, not just against one officer, but against a systemic problem she'd been fighting for years. As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, she noticed more patrol cars approaching in the distance. Officer Wilson was so focused on his perceived victory that he didn't notice the lights of multiple vehicles now converging on their location. The evening sky had darkened completely, but the real storm was just about to break. This arrest would soon prove to be Officer Wilson's biggest mistake, one that would shake the entire police department to its core. As he roughly guided her toward his patrol car, neither of them knew that this moment would soon be featured in police academy training videos across the country, though for very different reasons than the officer intended. The police station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Officer Wilson marched Agent Ann Lee through the precinct doors. The evening shift desk sergeant looked up from his computer, his eyebrows rising at the sight of a well-dressed woman in handcuffs. The lobby's usual quiet was broken only by the distant ringing of phones and the hum of conversation from the detective's room down the hall. "Got a live one here," Wilson announced proudly, his chest puffed out. "Caught her trying to pass herself off as FBI." He yanked Anne's credentials from his pocket, tossing them onto the surgeon's desk with an air of triumph. The desk sergeant, a veteran officer with graying hair and tired eyes, picked them up with considerably more respect than his colleague had shown. Anne stood quietly, her shoulders straight despite the discomfort of the handcuffs. She'd been in this building before, though usually on the other side of things, collaborating with local law enforcement on civil rights cases. Some of the faces around her even looked familiar, though no one seemed to recognize her yet. A young officer at a nearby desk was watching the scene unfold while pretending to file paperwork. His discomfort with the situation was visible in the way he kept glancing between his computer screen and the unfolding scene. The air conditioning hummed quietly in the background, a stark contrast to the tension building in the room. "Officer Wilson," Anne spoke up, her voice carrying across the now quieting room. "I'd like to make a phone call, as is my right. I also want to formally request your supervisor's presence." Her calm professionalism made Wilson's earlier aggression seem even more out of place. "Shut up," Wilson snapped, his composure finally cracking. "You don't make demands here." His voice echoed off the station's white walls, causing several officers to look up from their work. The desk sergeant's expression shifted from tired to concerned. A door opened down the hall, and footsteps approached. "What's all this about?" A firm voice cut through the tension. Lieutenant Thompson, a tall woman with sharp eyes and 3 decades of experience, emerged from her office. She took in the scene with a practiced eye, noting Wilson's aggressive stance and Anne's professional demeanor. "Ma'am," Wilson started, his voice taking on a different tone. "I caught this woman impersonating a federal agent during a routine traffic stop. She had fake credentials and—" "Those credentials," Anne interrupted calmly, "can be verified with one phone call to the FBI field office, where I've worked for the past 15 years. Lieutenant Thompson knows this, don't you, Lieutenant?" The lieutenant's eyes widened with recognition. The last time they'd met had been at an interagency task force meeting just 2 weeks ago. Wilson's face began to pale as he watched the interaction unfold. "Officer Wilson," Thompson's voice was razor sharp, "remove those handcuffs immediately." She turned to her right. "Someone get Deputy Director Richards on the phone. Now." The young officer who'd been watching jumped to action, nearly knocking over his coffee cup in his haste to reach the phone. The desk sergeant was already pulling up Wilson's body camera footage on his computer, his expression growing grimmer by the second. As the handcuffs came off, Anne rubbed her wrists gently. The red marks would fade, but the impact of this incident would leave lasting marks on the department. Through the station's windows, she could see the couple who'd witnessed her arrest talking to another officer in the parking lot, their phones likely containing valuable video evidence. Lieutenant Thompson turned to Wilson, who was now standing rigid, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "Officer, my office. Now." Her tone left no room for argument. The other officers in the room had abandoned any pretense of working, watching as their colleague's career imploded in real time. Anne knew this moment would reshape not just one officer's future, but potentially the entire department's approach to traffic stops and racial bias. As she pulled out her phone to make some necessary calls, she couldn't help but think about how this incident would become a powerful teaching moment, one that would resonate through police academies and training programs across the country. The police station's conference room had never felt so crowded. Deputy Director Richards of the FBI sat at one end of the long table, his presence commanding attention without saying a word. Agent Ann Lee sat beside him, a fresh cup of coffee warming her hands. Across from them, Lieutenant Thompson watched Officer Wilson as he squirmed in his chair, his earlier confidence completely shattered. The wall-mounted TV played his body camera footage in excruciating detail. Every inappropriate comment, every aggressive gesture, every moment of bias was crystal clear in high definition. The young couple's cell phone videos from across the street provided additional angles, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "Stop the video," Deputy Director Richards said quietly. His voice, though soft, carried the weight of decades in federal law enforcement. The technician quickly paused the playback, freezing on a frame that showed Wilson's hand gripping Anne's arm during the arrest. The air conditioning hummed in the background as Richards opened a thick folder. Officer Wilson, are you aware that Agent Lee is currently leading a nationwide investigation into law enforcement racial profiling? He didn't look up as he spread several photographs across the table. Images of Agent Lee at press conferences, speaking at police academy graduations, receiving commendations from the Attorney General. Wilson's face had gone from pale to ashen. His hands, folded in his lap, trembled slightly. The weight of his actions was finally sinking in, and it felt like a ton of bricks on his shoulders. Lieutenant Thompson cleared her throat. We've pulled your stop records for the past 3 years, Wilson. She slid another folder across the table. The pattern is concerning. The word concerning carried the heavy implication of career-ending statistics. A gentle knock at the door interrupted the tension. The desk surgeon entered with a stack of papers. Sorry to interrupt, but the press is starting to gather outside. Channel 4 is asking for a statement, and the video from the civilian witnesses has already hit social media. Anne watched Wilson's expression as reality crashed down around him. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. There would be no quiet reprimand, no paid leave until things blew over. This was going to be a watershed moment for the department, and he was at the center of it. Wilson started, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know she was FBI. And that's precisely the problem. Anne spoke for the first time since the meeting began. Would my treatment have been justified if I wasn't a federal agent? Should anyone be subjected to what your body camera just showed us? The questions hung in the air like heavy smoke. Outside the conference room, phones rang constantly as news of the incident spread. Officers walked past the door, trying to catch glimpses of what was happening inside. The story was spreading faster than anyone could control it. Deputy Director Richards closed his folder deliberately. Lieutenant Thompson, I trust you'll handle the immediate administrative actions. His tone made it clear this wasn't really a question. Agent Lee's civil rights investigation will need to expand to include this incident, of course. Wilson slumped in his chair, the full impact of his actions finally hitting home. His career, built over 12 years, had crumbled in a single traffic stop. But more than that, his actions had just handed the FBI irrefutable evidence of the very behavior they were investigating. Anne gathered her belongings, noting how the other officers in the room now looked at her with a mixture of respect and unease. Her impromptu arrest had accomplished what months of formal investigations might never have achieved. Clear, undeniable documentation of biased policing in action. As she stood to leave, she paused beside Wilson's chair. Your body camera footage will be used in training sessions across the country, she said quietly. Some good will come from this, Officer Wilson. Change often starts with difficult moments like these. The sun was rising outside, casting long shadows through the station's windows. A new day was beginning, but for this police department and Officer Wilson, nothing would ever be quite the same again. The morning news vans lined up outside the police station like a parade, their satellite dishes reaching toward the cloudy sky. Inside, the normally busy morning shift moved with unusual quietness, officers speaking in hushed tones as they passed by Lieutenant Thompson's office. The incident from the previous night had spread through social media like wildfire, and the department was now at the center of a national conversation. Agent Anne Lee sat in her FBI office, watching multiple news channels cover the story on muted screens. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn, calls from civil rights organizations, requests for interviews, and messages of support from colleagues across the country. The young couple who'd recorded the incident had already been interviewed on morning television, their video playing on repeat across every major network. Your coffee's getting cold, said her colleague, placing a fresh cup on her desk. The chief of police is holding a press conference in 20 minutes. Think we should watch it. Anne nodded, reaching for the remote. The station's press room appeared on screen, packed with reporters and cameras. The police chief stood at the podium, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something more somber. Behind him, a row of community leaders and police officials lined the wall, their expressions equally serious. "Last night's incident represents a failure," the chief began, his voice steady but heavy with responsibility. "Not just a failure of one officer, but a failure of our system. We've reviewed the body camera footage, civilian videos, and Officer Wilson's prior record. The evidence of bias is clear and undeniable." The room buzzed with camera shutters and hurried typing on laptops. Anne watched as the chief outlined immediate actions. Wilson's suspension pending a full investigation, a department-wide audit of traffic stops, and mandatory retraining for all officers. But it was his next words that made her lean forward in her chair. "We're also announcing a new partnership with the FBI's Civil Rights Division," he continued, "to develop comprehensive anti-bias training programs. Agent Lee's unfortunate experience will serve as a catalyst for real change in our department." Outside the police station, a small crowd had gathered. Community members held signs calling for accountability, while others offered coffee and words of support to officers entering the building. The scene reflected the complexity of the moment, a community grappling with hard truths while seeking a path forward. Back in her office, Anne reviewed emails from police departments across the country. Many were requesting copies of the incident footage for training purposes. Others shared their own stories of addressing bias within their ranks. The conversation was expanding beyond one traffic stop, beyond one officer, into something much more significant. Lieutenant Thompson appeared in Anne's doorway later that afternoon looking tired but determined. "Officer Wilson submitted his resignation an hour ago," she said quietly. "He included a letter. I think you should read it." Anne accepted the envelope, noting the slight shake in her hands as she opened it. Wilson's handwritten words filled the page. "I never saw myself as part of the problem. Each stop, each arrest, I told myself I was just doing my job. But watching that footage, seeing myself through the lens of that body camera, I couldn't hide from the truth anymore. My actions didn't just hurt you. They hurt the badge I wore, the department I served, and the community that trusted me. I'm sorry isn't enough, but it's where I have to start." The letter continued, but Anne had to pause, emotions catching in her throat. This wasn't about victory or vindication. It was about recognition, understanding, and the hard work of creating change. As the day drew to a close, Anne gathered her things to head home. The news vans were still outside, their lights bright against the gathering dusk. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. Amid the chaos and controversy, there was also hope. Hope that this incident, painful as it was, would lead to meaningful transformation in how law enforcement approached their crucial role in society. 3 weeks after the incident, the police department's largest training room was filled to capacity. Agent Anne Lee stood at the podium, facing rows of officers, some curious, some uncomfortable, all attentive. The PowerPoint screen behind her showed a still image from that fateful traffic stop, a moment frozen in time that had sparked a nationwide conversation. "What you're about to see isn't meant to shame or blame," Anne began, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "It's meant to help us understand how unconscious bias can affect even routine interactions." She pressed the remote, and Officer Wilson's body camera footage began to play. In the third row, a rookie officer shifted in his seat, watching his former colleague's actions unfold on screen. The room was silent except for the audio from the video and the occasional scratch of pens on notepads. Some officers looked down at moments, perhaps recognizing similar behaviors in their own past actions. "Stop the video there," Anne said, freezing on a frame where Wilson's hand moved to his weapon. "What do we notice about this moment? What triggered this response?" She encouraged discussion, watching his hands slowly raised across the room. A veteran officer spoke up from the back. "There was no threat," he said quietly. Nothing in her actions warranted an aggressive response. Others nodded in agreement, the reality of the situation becoming clearer through the lens of analysis. The training session was part of a larger departmental overhaul. In the corner, Lieutenant Thompson sat with community leaders who had been invited to participate in the program development. Their input had been crucial in creating a curriculum that addressed real concerns while remaining practical for officers on the street. Let's talk about traffic stop protocols. Anne continued, changing the slide. We've reviewed 5 years of department data. The patterns we found weren't just about individual choices. They revealed systemic issues that need systemic solutions. The next hour involved role-playing exercises, with officers switching roles between police and civilians. The scenarios were carefully crafted from real incidents, forcing participants to confront their own potential biases in a safe, learning environment. During the break, officers gathered around coffee and donuts, their conversations more open and thoughtful than in previous weeks. The initial defensiveness had given way to genuine reflection. One officer approached Anne, holding a cup of coffee with slightly shaking hands. "I've been on the force for 20 years, he said, his voice low. Watching that footage, I saw myself in some of those moments. Things I did without thinking, assumptions I made without realizing. How do we fix 20 years of learned behavior?" Anne smiled gently. "We start by acknowledging it, just like you're doing now. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it happens one conversation, one traffic stop, one decision at a time." The afternoon session focused on practical changes. New protocols were introduced for traffic stops, including mandatory supervisor notification for any stop lasting more than 15 minutes. Body camera footage would be randomly reviewed by a panel that included both officers and community members. As the training wound down, Anne shared one final piece of news. The department would be one of the first in the country to implement a new program where officers could anonymously submit their own concerns about bias, either their own or their colleagues, for review and support. "This isn't about punishment," Lieutenant Thompson added, standing beside Anne. "It's about growth, about building trust, both within our department and with our community." The session ended with a group discussion. Officers shared their own experiences, their fears, and their hopes for the future. The conversation wasn't always comfortable, but it was real and necessary. As the officers filed out, many stopped to shake Anne's hand or share a quiet word of thanks. The incident that could have deepened divisions was instead building bridges, creating understanding where there had been fear and defensiveness. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the training room windows. Anne gathered her materials, feeling both tired and hopeful. Real change was happening in this room, in this department, and hopefully soon across the country. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and the small coffee shop across from the police station buzzed with morning activity. Agent Ann Lee stirred her coffee, sitting across from Lieutenant Thompson. Between them lay a report filled with statistics and graphs, the first comprehensive review of the department's reform efforts. "The numbers are encouraging," Thompson said, tapping the page showing traffic stop data. "Complaints are down 60%, and our community satisfaction surveys are showing real improvement." She smiled, the kind of smile that came from genuine pride rather than obligation. Through the window, they could see officers chatting with local residents on the sidewalk. The stiff, anxious interactions of the past had been replaced by something more natural, more human. Even morning patrol briefings now included discussions about community engagement and bias awareness. "Remember that couple who recorded the incident?" Anne asked, pulling up a news article on her tablet. "They're now part of our Civilian Oversight Committee. Their experience that night turned them into some of our strongest advocates for police reform." The article showed photos from recent community meetings where officers and residents worked together to address neighborhood concerns. The fear and mistrust that had once defined these interactions was giving way to something new: partnership. Anne's phone buzzed with a notification. Another police department, this time from across the country, was requesting their training materials. The incident had sparked a movement that was spreading far beyond their city limits. "Got an interesting email this morning," Thompson said, pulling out her own phone. "Remember Officer Wilson?" She slid the phone across the table, showing an email with an attached photo. Wilson stood in front of a college classroom, apparently giving a presentation. "He's been speaking at criminal justice programs," Thompson explained, sharing his story, helping future officers understand how unconscious bias can affect their judgment. Says it's his way of making amends. The bell of the coffee shop door chimed as a rookie officer entered. She was part of the first class to go through their new training program. Spotting Anne and Thompson, she approached their table with a tablet in hand. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I wanted to show you something from last night's patrol." She pulled up her body camera footage, showing an interaction with a driver during a late-night stop. The difference was stark. Clear communication, respectful interaction, no assumptions made. This was what change looked like in action. Later that afternoon, Anne stood in front of a new group of FBI trainees, sharing the lessons learned from her experience. The incident that could have been just another statistic had instead become a powerful teaching tool. The easy thing would have been to seek punishment alone, she told the attentive faces before her. The harder path was to use this moment to create lasting change. Real reform doesn't come from replacing people. It comes from changing how we think, how we act, and how we serve our communities. As she drove home that evening, Anne passed the spot where she'd been pulled over 6 months ago. The street looked the same, but everything else had changed. The department's new policies were being studied and adopted by agencies across the country. The training programs they developed were being shared nationwide. Her phone rang through the car speakers. Another police department requesting her help with their reform efforts. This was her new normal, turning a moment of injustice into an opportunity for transformation. The sun was setting as she pulled into her driveway, casting warm light across the neighborhood. Children played basketball in the street, waving at a passing patrol car. The officer inside waved back, then stopped to join their game for a few minutes. This was the real measure of success, not in statistics or reports, but in these small, human moments where trust replaced fear and understanding overcame bias. The incident that had started with a traffic stop had grown into something much bigger, a blueprint for change that would influence law enforcement for years to come.